Hello friends, welcome back to my kitchen and to another week of the Three Rivers Challenge. If you're not familiar with this challenge, it's just an opportunity to use up all the food you already have in the house in preparation for the upcoming gardening season and another season of food preservation. So I'm participating in the challenge by not grocery shopping for anything that my family eats for dinner. So all of our dinners this past week came from the freezer, my pantry, or things that we already had in the fridge from weeks past that needed to be used up. I'm really liking the way this is making me think about what I want to grow more of in this upcoming gardening season. And it's also forcing me to just learn how to be creative and use what I have on hand rather than shopping for things from a recipe. So let me show you what we've been eating this week. Our week starts with a simple meal of sweet potato fries and hamburgers. I love this because it's something that everybody's happy to eat. This is the last sweet potato that I got from my parents from their garden, and I haven't made sweet potato fries for the kids before, but the air fryer makes it really easy. So I like using that French fry setting, and I can walk away and start on the hamburgers. For our burgers, I've pulled some ground beef from the freezer. This is from a local farmer. And to keep it gluten-free, I'm using almond flour instead of breadcrumbs. Then I just add some Worcestershire sauce and some onion powder, a bit of milk, some garlic powder sprinkled in, and I'm also sprinkling in some salt, of course. You'll notice I don't include eggs. Eggs are really useful for binding together hamburgers, but my daughter has an egg allergy. So I just skip the eggs in my burgers. They're a little bit more crumbly, but it doesn't hurt the flavor. I've got a bit of coconut oil in the pan to keep the burgers from sticking. And then I always like to let meat sit long enough that the underside is browned and a bit caramelized when I flip it. Finish out the meal with a vegetable, I'm adding some fermented sauerkraut from cabbage from our garden. Because we skipped the bun, the burger's just finished off with condiments. I need to grow more jalapenos next year. Pickled jalapenos would be the perfect topping to finish this off. Tuesday is roast chicken day for us again. Because this is something we have weekly or every other week, one of the ways that I try to change it up is changing out the seasonings that I use on the chicken. So the basic formula for me for a roast chicken is stuffing the cavity with something to add flavor, and then pouring melted butter over the skin and rubbing seasoning into that and cooking at 425 for about 90 minutes. This week, to give our chicken a different flavor than last week, I'm using a Cajun seasoning blend. I keep this seasoning blend on hand in my pantry, and we really like it, so I'll make sure to include the recipe down below. roast chicken days, I like to prepare sides that also roast at the same temperature as the chicken. It just makes life easier for me if everything can go in the oven at once. So today I'm preparing some butternut squash that came from the summer garden. I definitely learned a few lessons this past year from the summer garden, and one was that I want to grow more food that doesn't take effort to process and preserve. So for example, this squash was just picked and left outside so that it could cure, and then it was ready to go into storage and has been feeding us for months. I want to make things a little easier on myself this summer by growing more butternut squash, some pumpkins, more potatoes, sweet potatoes, things that I can just pick and put in a cool place, and they'll feed us throughout the winter. The final piece of this meal is more green beans from the garden that have been stored in the freezer. These green beans have been feeding us really well, but I also want to make sure that this year I grow more vegetables that I can freeze or preserve for the winter, because green beans have been the green thing that we have in storage. I'm hoping I could grow enough broccoli to freeze some broccoli, maybe grow more cabbage to store as sauerkraut, and things like that. Lots of aspirations. We'll see. I've been trying to do little things to make dinner time feel more special lately. One of those things is allowing myself to just use special dinnerware. So for example, these plates are some of my favorites. They're handmade. Normally they're not something I allowed our kids to use, but I've decided it's time to get them out because sitting in the cupboard for years doesn't really do us any good. After dinner, leftover chicken gets pulled off the bone and put in the fridge for lunches this week. And then if you saw last week's video, you know the drill. Bones and drippings go into the slow cooker to become broth. I put some vegetable scraps on top, cover everything with water, and then a bit of vinegar, apple cider vinegar, helps to draw the nutrients out of the bones. Wednesday morning, I start off with making some bread. Last week, I tried breaking with einkorn for the first time. My husband and I have been gluten-free for a couple of months, and I've been wanting to try einkorn to see if it seems a little easier on our digestion. And so I made einkorn pizza dough last week, and it was delicious, and we actually felt fine on it. So I thought this week I'd try baking with einkorn again and bake an einkorn loaf. If you haven't baked with einkorn before, I'm obviously new to it. Last week was my first time, but I'm learning that it has a lower gluten content, and so it has to be handled differently. It does not like to be kneaded like our modern white flour likes to be kneaded. When you knead dough, it builds up gluten content, but this has a low gluten content naturally, and actually does not want to be overworked. So it's a very sticky dough. It comes together loosely, And then after a good rise time, it does bake to that nice kind of stretchy texture of a good bread. While the dough is rising, I'm getting started on the soup. This recipe was definitely improvised from what we had on hand. It turned out pretty good, but I had to alter a lot of things as I went, so I don't have a recipe to write down for you. Hopefully this is just a reminder that you can feel free to play and make things up as you go, especially with soup. Soup is pretty forgiving if you have a good broth. I'm starting off with some sweet Italian sausage, and I'm just cutting open these casings because I want to brown this meat and have it be a loose meat in the soup. Added in some onions and let them cook until translucent, and then made some space and added in the garlic. I'm always struggling to avoid burning my garlic, so I try to put that in the last moment before I add in some more wet ingredients. I've got a beautiful bowl of broth from last night's chicken, and that's going to really make this soup, as always. I've got a little leftover broth that I'll store in the fridge. This is always nice to have on hand for cooking rice. Next, I'm adding a block of frozen diced tomatoes. These were in the freezer from the summer. You can tell I'm down to the dregs of my pantry here. These are the last of my potatoes. They look rough on the outside, but they're good on the inside. They are going in the pot. Once those potatoes have cooked through, I'm supplementing by adding in my final jar of canned potatoes. So I have come to the end of all my potatoes. Next, I'm adding in some frozen spinach and some frozen kale. This is from my mom's garden. I'm helping empty out her freezer and pantry too, because I've run out of my own greens. I told you this was an improvised soup, and I meant it. At this point, I realized there's not enough meat. There's a lot of broth, tomatoes, potatoes, and I didn't want it to be light on meat. So I'm frying up 2 more sausages, and they will go into the pot, and then I think the soup will be nicely balanced. Next, I added some cream. And after tasting the broth, decided to add some Italian seasonings, just an Italian seasoning blend. The sausages already had seasoning in them, so it didn't need a lot, but a little bit balanced things out nicely. Now that the soup is finished, I can return to my bread. I checked on the dough after an hour and it had not grown much at all. So I gave it 4 hours actually in total. And now I'm just shaping it into a loaf shape, and it'll get another half-hour rise in the pan, and then it's ready for the oven. All right, now we're gonna cover it. Oh, I look for it. I'm not gonna do it. That's it. You got it, girl. This bread was so good. I'm really excited at the possibility of being able to eat more bread. So I need to get more einkorn flour. I think this loaf might become a regular fixture in our house. Thursday is taco bowls day with peach cobbler for dessert. So I'm starting off by getting this rice going. I'm going to use that leftover broth from yesterday. This is a great way to sneak some extra nutrition into our rice and just make it rich and flavorful. With the rice cooking, my daughter and I get started on the peach cobbler. I pulled these peaches from the freezer this morning. They're peaches that I picked from a local orchard this summer. So I'm using a gluten-free peach cobbler recipe that I haven't used before. I'd tried one in the past that I didn't like very much. This one looked better to me. So we're starting off by making the crumb topping. It's sweetened with maple syrup instead of sugar. And we're using my favorite flour substitute here, King Arthur's Measure for Measure. With that crumb topping in the fridge, we're getting started on the filling. The filling has peaches. It's sweetened again with maple syrup, thickened with that Measure for Measure flour, seasoned with some cinnamon and vanilla. And we're skipping the nutmeg in the recipe because we don't happen to have it on hand. I know it would taste better with fresh lemon juice, but again, we're working with what we have, trying to use up what's in the fridge, freezer, and pantry. My son decided he wanted to get in on the action too, so we have lots of little hands helping today.
I'm mixing it.
This is just a gentle mix. And now that the cobbler's in the oven, I can prepare the rest of the ingredients for our taco bowls. So these are some pinto beans that I canned, and I'm using some of my mom's canned tomato sauce to cook the ground beef for taco meat. I keep a fajita seasoning blend on hand. I know fajita seasoning and taco seasoning aren't exactly the same, but to me it doesn't make much difference. I use them interchangeably, and so this is something just convenient to always have on my pantry shelf. I use it for taco nights, fajita nights, taco soup, those sorts of things. The last thing I'm preparing for our taco bowls are some peppers from the summer garden. These have been frozen in strips, and I just like to caramelize them along with some strips of onions. This is the very last of the summer's bell peppers. So this challenge is serving its purpose. I am cleaning out the contents of the freezer and the pantry. So here's our dinner lineup. We have rice, pinto beans, taco meat, grilled pepper and onions, cheese, salsa from the summer garden, and sour cream. These meals work well for us because everyone can personalize their plate. I like to put everything on mine. We had our peach cobbler for dessert, and I will definitely be using this recipe again. I especially like the crumble topping. It did not last 24 hours in our house. Finally, to finish out the week, I'm making dal and rice, or Indian lentils and rice. This was a weekly staple for John and I before kids, and I don't think I've made it since we've had kids because I wasn't sure if they'd eat it. So this is an experiment tonight. When I'm making rice for an Indian dish, I often like to put in a drizzle of oil, a sprinkling of salt, and a few cardamom pods. The lentils are rinsed until the water runs clear, and then they're placed on the stove with some water for a slow simmer. Scum rises to the surface as they cook, and this is best to just skim off. Fortunately, I do have fresh garlic and ginger on hand. Every time that I've tried to grate ginger, it just gets stringy and gets stuck in the grater. So for me, the best way to mince ginger has been to peel it and then chop those shavings. Here I'm cooking the onions in some coconut oil with a bit of cumin and mustard seeds. And I'm adding in some tomatoes that were in the freezer from the summer garden. I did not have all of the seasonings on hand that this recipe called for. I'm out of garam masala, and this calls for some very specific seasonings I don't keep on hand, like fenugreek. I'm not even sure if I pronounced that correctly. But I try not to let that stop me from making a recipe as long as I'm okay with it not tasting exactly like I might expect. So I'm being flexible here, using some cumin, some coriander, some turmeric, and I'm okay with this being its own dish tonight. Finally, to add a vegetable to our spread, I'm preparing the second half of the head of cabbage that I cooked last week. So same drill as last week. I slice it as finely as possible, which produces these little shreds, and those go into a pan with about 1/3 cup of water and some pats of butter on top, and that's covered to steam until it's tender. Then I finish it off with salt and garlic powder. I don't generally think of cabbage as a side that goes with Indian food, but I know that if my kids won't eat the dal, they will eat the rice and the cabbage. So I think we'll just do an East meets West thing tonight. There was a beautiful sunset tonight as I set the table. Thanks for joining me and my family for another week of cooking from the freezer and from the pantry. This has been really good for getting creative with our cooking and learning what we need in this year's garden. Please share and subscribe to join me for more cooking and garden projects, and I'll see you next week.